And welcome back for part 2 of today's two-part webinar series. My name is Mike Fitch with the Ohio LTAP Center here at ODOT, and we appreciate your participation. As a reminder, the questions box is available in the GoToWebinar panel, so please feel free to send in any questions you might have. And looking at the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel, please note also that a copy of the presentation for this afternoon is available for reference. So with that, let's bring back Ron Eck. Hello, Ron.
Hi, Mike. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone, for part 2. I'll just point out my email address is on this slide. Feel free to make a note of that. If you have questions or concerns after class, feel free to contact me. If not, let's continue on. And now we're going to get into kind of the specifics of accessible, detectable, temporary paths, look at some of the tools, but start out with a few kind of introductory comments in terms of what to consider. I call this considerations in creating an accessible alternate pathway. So look at the general environment. Are there pedestrian generators in close proximity to the traffic control zone? Pedestrian generators like schools, shopping areas, community or senior centers, transit facilities. Look for, those are all I call pedestrian generators, and that may influence kind of the solution that we come up with in terms of how we handle the work zones. Also look at traffic characteristics, both motorized, but also maybe bicycles or scooters or micro mobility, whatever you might have in the area. But probably motor vehicles are going to maybe be the predominant thing to look at, but look at the speeds. And I would look at the actual operating speeds, not just the speed limit, because of course operating speeds may be higher than the speed limit. Look at traffic volumes on the roadways. Are there any other significant kind of things to think about in terms of the motor vehicle traffic stream, like a large amount of large commercial vehicles, buses, trucks, those kinds of things. These next two slides may relate, I think, to one of the questions that I postponed this morning. What about if you have few or no pedestrians, but you do have a sidewalk that's closed? That alternate pathway needs to have the same level of accessibility as the one it's replacing, and there should be no curbs or abrupt changes in grade or terrain that could cause a tripping hazard or be a barrier to someone using an assistive device, mobility assistive device. A question that comes up sometimes, and maybe you can't remember the exact details of the question this morning, but what if there's no sidewalk, but you're going to be doing some work maybe on the side of the road, that sort of thing. And my advice is, if there's no sidewalk, no wide shoulder where pedestrians walk, or no evidence of pedestrian activity, like I think we've all seen the goat paths, in the, say, worn in the shoulder, the grass along the shoulder of a road, or no visual observation of people walking, the project may not require an accessible alternative pedestrian route. But I would be sure to document that. Like maybe you were out at the location a month or two earlier doing some pre-construction type of work, and maybe you were there an hour or two and you didn't see any pedestrians walking along the road. I would make a note of that. I was here on such and such a day for this time and didn't see any pedestrians. Or maybe you look at the grass along the side of the road and it looks kind of pristine. There's no goat trail worn in there, no kind of real evidence of pedestrian activity. I would even take a photograph of that and sort of document that, it appears there's really no pedestrian activity here, so we are not going to be providing an accessible alternative pedestrian route. So documentation is important, and a lot of what we're talking about today. A conclusion would be, document, document, document. But having said that, I would say maybe you should talk to the crew or train the crew of how to handle the situation if a pedestrian does show up. I am always struck here in West Virginia, we have a lot of rural roadways out in the countryside, winding roads. And sometimes I'll come around a corner on a curve on a 2-lane road out in the middle of nowhere, really. And there on the shoulder is somebody scooting along in a power wheelchair. So that's my point, is even though there may not really be evidence of pedestrians or disabled pedestrians, they may from time to time be present. So at least maybe educate the crew of what happens if somebody in a motorized wheelchair does come along. How are we going to get them through the work area? And at least have a plan for that, even though you may not ever have to implement it. I think I mentioned this section in the MUTCD in part 1 earlier today, that pedestrian detours should be avoided since pedestrians, able-bodied pedestrians, may not observe them, and the cost of providing that accessibility and detectability may outweigh the cost of maintaining a continuous route on the original sidewalk. And where we can, the work should be done in a manner that does not create a need to detour pedestrians. So that should be what we strive for. But of course, we can't always do that. Sometimes we do need to have detours. And also note, depending on traffic characteristics and the surrounding environment, a route that uses a vehicle lane width, for example, a parking lane for the pedestrian path, may be shorter, safer, and more usable than one that requires pedestrians to cross to the other side of the street and then back to their original side of the street. And remember, able-bodied pedestrians are not likely to backtrack. Like this fellow you see here, sidewalk is closed. That's not a proper closure from a PROWAG perspective or MUTCD perspective, but notice he probably had no intention of backtracking. He's going to walk in the street. But remember, a person in a wheelchair with an assistive device, that they can't get to the street because there's no curb ramp. So they're going to have to backtrack and turn around. A blind pedestrian who encountered this location, once they figured out what was going on, because without a detectable edge, it's not immediately obvious that the sidewalk is closed, they would also have to backtrack to, say, a corner and then reestablish their bearings and figure out how to proceed from there. I mentioned earlier transit, but remember, we do need to, in addition to the pedestrian path in general, we do need to provide access to businesses in an area and to transit stops. And that may necessitate having temporary ramps and maybe guide rails from the pedestrian pathway to building entrances. And if transit stops are going to be affected by the temporary traffic control setup, work with the transit agency to see if temporary stops are needed or how the situation can be addressed. This, I think, is one of the challenges we face in the public right-of-way, and there's not always a good answer for it. Notice section 6F.02 of the manual says neither portable nor permanent sign supports should be located on sidewalks, bicycle facilities, or areas designated for pedestrians or bicyclists. So here we have a road work ahead sign in the sidewalk or on the sidewalk, blocking the sidewalk. And like I say, it's a challenge. This is work in the road, apparently, not on the sidewalk. And so these devices, of course, are required also by Part 6 of the MUTCD. And its placement here now creates an inaccessible sidewalk on this block that pedestrians can't use this particular sidewalk. And like I say, it's a challenge. It looks like there's a bus lane immediately adjacent to the curb, so we can't put the sign there. Looks like there's some landscaping and such, shrubs at the back of the sidewalk may make it difficult to put the sign there. But in in addressing these, we should remember accessibility and the PROWAG requirements as well. But I recognize it can be tough to kind of try to satisfy both criteria. Well, now let's look at the components of an accessible, detectable temporary path. I think I've alluded to some of these before, maybe others not, but these are the things that make up an accessible and detectable temporary path. Detectable edging, channelizing devices, the pathway width and surface, temporary ramps, sidewalk closures, and then audible devices. So we'll look at each of these and talk about some of the issues and requirements. But before we do that, I want to note section 6C.02 of the manual. To emphasize again, I've alluded to this, but it bears repeating. Tape, rope, or plastic chain strung between devices should not be used to control pedestrian movements because they are not detectable and are therefore not accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. And in spite of that, these still seem to be ubiquitous all over the place. I see caution tape all over. I think people think it has kind of supernatural power to keep pedestrians out of an area, but in fact, it does not. And oftentimes, as we see in both photos here, oftentimes you see a lot of that yellow tape is lying on the ground where it's kind of useless. And so we shouldn't be using caution tape and things like that for work zone traffic control. Edging, detectable edging of channelizing devices. And PROWAG says where a channelizing device is used to delineate an alternate pedestrian access route, continuous detectable edging complying with R303.6 shall be provided throughout the length of the route. So notice PROWAG requires the continuous detectable edging. And here's what section R303.6 specifically talks about in terms of this detectable edging. It says the top of the top detectable edging shall be no lower than 32 inches above the walking surface and be free of sharp or abrasive surfaces. And the reason for that latter requirement there is that because some visually impaired pedestrians use what's called hand trailing, meaning they don't kind of use it for load bearing or weight bearing or support, but they'll run their hands lightly along the top of a device to help them navigate the situation. And so if somebody's kind of sliding their hand along the top of a rail, if you will, we don't want, for example, nails or splinters or that sort of thing sticking up from that surface that could injure someone. Then R303.6.2 says the bottom of the bottom detectable edging shall be 2 inches above the walking, 2 inches maximum above the walking surface. And we had a comment or question about this earlier today. And we'll talk about that maybe one or two more times, but that 2 inches max above the walking surface is pretty common in PROWAG and the MUTCD.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah.
Yeah, we had two quick questions, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Question from JZ. He says, what should be used instead of caution tape, barricades? Any additional comments there?
Yeah, actually, I hope the next few sections, maybe the next half hour or so of our discussion, will show some of the devices that could be used in place of the caution tape, including this material here, the edging, but also, for example, the channelizing devices and barricades we'll talk about.
Okay. Question from Lisa, and you might talk about this later. Could snow fence be used as a channelizer is her question.
All Are you talking about the, I'm old enough, most of you may not be, but I remember when I was young, the snow fence that was used along, for example, limited access highways was kind of wood slats or strips that were connected by some sort of wiring. I think the current snow fence is more like the orange plastic material. I would say the first type of snow fence I mentioned, those wooden slats, that would not be an edging material. The plastic netting type might be if it's attached appropriately to a structure, and I'll show an example of that.
Thanks, Ron. We have a question from Michael. He says, quote, I will guess contractors will not willingly want to comply with pedestrian access as described without requesting more dollars. And he says, what is or should be written in the spec to require this compliance to provide ADA access during construction? Some of this is only a few days, so how many days are considered okay to not have ADA access before forcing them to provide the temporary access, end quote.
Yeah, good observation, good comment, good question. I have a bullet point about that at the end. It's probably not as specific as you're asking about, but maybe if you still have questions after I get to that as one of my kind of wrap up points or best practices, maybe if you don't mind, raise that question again. But that's a good observation, and that's an important part of gaining compliance with these requirements, obviously.
All right, thanks, Ron. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks for the good questions. So what does the MUTCD say about detectable edging? This is section 6M.04, and notice, remember, PROWAG requires it. It was a shall. In the MUTCD, it's a should. So this is a discrepancy. And I've been advised that FHWA is aware of this, and the next edition of the MUTCD, I guess it would be the 12th edition, whenever it comes out, it will bring consistency, which to me would be, it'll probably be a shall. So the MUTCD likely will require that detectable edging. But right now, I wanted to note that there is a discrepancy. My advice would be to follow PROWAG in this case. But in terms of the kind of the dimensional requirements, notice these are pretty similar. The MUTCD says it should extend at least 8 inches above a surface of the pathway, with the bottom of the edging a maximum of 2 inches above the surface. And it says it should be firmly attached to the ground or to other devices, and adjacent sections should be interconnected. So what are some examples of detectable edging? There are a variety of things that will work. Could be prefabricated lightweight sections of plastic or metal or other suitable materials that are interconnected and fixed in place to form a continuous edge. It could be sections of lumber interconnected and fixed in place to form a continuous edge. It could be formed in place asphalt or concrete curb. That would be detectable edging. It could be continuous temporary traffic barriers or channelizing barricades that we'll talk about in a few minutes, that are fixed to form a continuous edge. And I don't know if anyone's seen this, or maybe someone's using it. I have seen photographs and videos of it. I have never actually seen it with my own eyes, but there's a company that makes chain link fence. And of course, normally chain link fence would not be considered a detectable edge, but the bottom, I don't know, 6 inches to a foot is kind of a plastic or timber continuous rail or bottom rail. So it's like chain link fence up top, and then there's like a toe board or kick plate at the bottom. If anybody's seen that or using that or has experience with it, if you'd want to make a note in chat, we'd appreciate somebody sharing that experience. But the point is, all of these, or any of these really, can be suitable as detectable edging. So you can see some of it can kind of be homemade, others can be available for purchase commercially. So how about these two? Let's look at the right-hand image first. And let me get my pointer or my cursor here. How about this one? Let's say the sidewalk is 5 feet wide. In fact, here we have a visually impaired pedestrian. Notice there is a lower rail here. I don't think this is 6 inches high though. So I don't think this would qualify as detectable edging. That's my criticism with this with respect to PROWAG and MUTCD requirements. But actually, generally, I have a bigger criticism. Let's imagine this is 6 inches high. Let's say it's 8 inches high. Let's say we have a board down here 8 inches high. So that would comply with PROWAG and the MUTCD. But what do you think about safety of this construction site? Notice there is a rail here. It looks pretty high actually, but there is a rail here. But notice all this open space. Somebody could get into that work area. In fact, it looks like this is an excavation here. A child could get in there and be seriously injured. So if you recall what I said in part one, PROWAG is an accessibility criteria. It's not a safety criteria. It's still up to us as transportation professionals to build safety into these work zones and into these projects. So let's imagine this is 8 inches high here. That would comply with PROWAG, but I think we'd all agree this doesn't comply with good construction site safety practice just generally. So always think about the safety in addition to the accessibility. How about the one on the left here? This looks like it's homemade, which is fine. And Lisa, I don't know if that's the type of snow fence you were talking about, but that's the one type I mentioned. And notice they have, looks like nailed or stapled that material to a kind of a timber frame. If this toe board or kick plate down here, if this is at least 6 inches high, which it looks like it might be, and if these are attached to each other and fixed to the ground, in my opinion, this would be a suitable detectable edging. One concern I have, not so much with this one, but with others I've seen, is that sometimes over time, or even due to original construction, but sometimes the netting here may start to sag. And I've heard of cases, especially if it sags down here, where the cane tip has gotten caught into that, tangled up in the netting, which is of course not good. So if you'd use this approach, I would say it's important that you maybe, educate the field crews that they need to pay attention to make sure that that stuff stays taut and doesn't start sagging. But what we see here, in my opinion, this would be an acceptable detectable edging. And in fact, it looks like they could maybe disassemble these and maybe reuse them on other job sites. So any questions or comments on that? So that was edging. Next category is pedestrian channelizing devices. And these are devices like you see here in the photograph that indicate to pedestrians, including the visually impaired, a suitable path of travel either through or around the work zone. These are addressed in section 6K.02 of the MUTCD. And notice it specifically requires, there's a shall here, devices used to channelize pedestrians shall be detectable to users of long canes and visible to persons with low vision. So that means in terms of like color and contrast should be such that low vision pedestrians can see them as well. And notice the second bullet point there, and we'll talk about this again because it's important. The MUTCD says when used as a sidewalk closure, the device shall cover the entire width of the sidewalk. So if you're closing a sidewalk, there needs to be a detectable barricade across the entire width of the sidewalk. And the MUTCD goes on to say that, and notice there's a bunch of shalls here, that channelizing devices shall have continuous detection plates and hand trailing edges. And I spoke about hand trailing earlier. The bottom of the detection plate shall be no higher than 2 inches above the walkway. There's that 2 inches again. The top edge of the detection plate shall be at least 8 inches above the walkway. So at least 6-inch high detection plate there. The top of the hand trailing edge shall be no lower than 32 inches and no higher than 38 inches above the walkway. And further, they say the top surface of the hand trailing edge shall be smooth. So it's a requirement in the MUTCD that that top surface be smooth. Of course, there's really no definition of what smooth is in terms of specifics, but appreciate that it should be something that someone could kind of slide their hand over without encountering a sharp edge or like a nail or splinters or that sort of thing. And furthermore, both the detection plate and the hand trailing edge shall share a common vertical plane, which is another way of saying there shall be no protruding objects. And this, some of you may recognize this. This is figure 6K-2, which I just took from the MUTCD. And this is a few years old, I would say. There's other techniques and technology, but this is one that's mentioned or identified in the MUTCD. But notice they have the detection plate down here. I sometimes call it toe boards or kick plates. And then they have the hand trailing edge up here, and then you can kind of see an elevation or cross-section view of it in the upper drawing. Here are some other compliant channelizing devices. Notice here on the right, type 2 pedestrian barricade. Again, notice no more than 2 inches from the ground to that bottom rail on the barricade. And then here you see on the left side, these would typically be plastic, I guess, kind of the longitudinal channelizing devices. And again, the 2-inch maximum between the ground and the bottom of the device. So here's an example. Notice in this city, they are closing the sidewalk, it looks like for some building construction work. And they're detouring pedestrians, looks like into the street. And this is the device used to close the sidewalk, and the sign indicates detour. So it looks like a type 3 barrier as defined by part 6 of the MUTCD. Is that compliant? And I would say no, because notice that's more than 2 inches from the ground to the bottom rail of that type 3 barricade. So the type 3 barricade is fine in the roadway for vehicular traffic, but it is not a compliant channelizer in terms of pedestrian traffic because of the height or elevation difference between the ground and that bottom rail. Now this is a different city, different project, but here it looks like they're closing part of the sidewalk and want to channelize pedestrians under the canopy here. This is the alternate access route. And notice they still have a type 3 barricade, but notice they've put in a bottom rail here, basically at the ground level. Looks like it's flush with the sidewalk to be the detectable edge. So I think this is better. They have made that type 3 barricade now a detectable pedestrian channelizer. But of course, we don't want to take that out onto the roadway because that device with this bottom rail has not been tested for crash worthiness on the roadway. But in the sidewalk environment, that is one way to convert a type 3 barricade to a detectable channelizing device. So just in summary again, these are the requirements for the channelizing devices. They need to be cane ready, have a continuous smooth bottom rail, need to be capable of hand trailing, so a continuous smooth upper rail, should be obstacle free, a common plane, no intrusions into the pathway, and they need to be continuous. They need to be connected with no gaps. So as we look here for next time we have remaining, I'll show some examples of different setups. These are the things you should sort of look for when you're looking at channelizers. And here's an example of what I mean by the hand trailing. Notice here's a kind of, looks like maybe a detour route. You can see they have the channelizers. Here's the pedestrian path, and you can see this individual is doing the hand trailing, and you can see here the top of the device. Since they're plastic, it's smooth plastic, and somebody can run their hand on that and trail their hand along that edge. And it appears that, at least what we see here in the foreground, that these are properly interconnected. There's no gaps between the devices. I did want to note that these longitudinal channelizing devices, I call them sometimes pedestrian channelizers, they have not met the crash-worthy requirements for temporary traffic barriers. So if your project calls for positive protection for workers or pedestrians, these are not the devices to use. These are pedestrian channelizers. They're not intended to shield obstacles or provide positive protection for pedestrians or workers. If you need that positive protection or shielding obstacles, this is what you need to use, the temporary traffic barriers. These have been tested and proven to be crash worthy and designed to be crash worthy. So I wanted to point out and distinguish that the pedestrian channelizers are not the same thing as temporary traffic barriers. And I think I have a few examples here to illustrate how each would be used. Also, just keep in mind the temporary traffic barriers, since one face of them faces traffic, if you will, they need to be supplemented with standard delineation of pavement markings or channelizing devices for improved visibility, since they are used to channelize vehicular traffic. How about this? Talking about channelizing pedestrians. This looks like the alternate route, the sidewalks being narrowed. Looks plenty wide, looks definitely more than 4 or 5 feet wide. Looks like there's for much of the way, there's a detectable edge along the storefronts here, or the buildings. But to me, these drums do not provide a detectable edge. They need to put in some type of detectable edging here along this route. And then a bigger concern, probably from a safety standpoint, maybe more so than accessibility, is notice it's possible that someone can get on this side of the project or of the work and really end up in harm's way here with this large opening. So there needs to be some sort of, in my opinion, some sort of detectable barricade here to prevent pedestrians from getting into that portion of the work area, and make sure they stay in the alternate access route here along the buildings. So again, we have to consider both safety and accessibility. How about this? I think I mentioned, took a few photos when I was in Minneapolis a few years ago. These are a couple of those photos. This was not sure what the project was, but you can see they have some piping here going across the sidewalk. Of course, that's not accessible, and so they put in a kind of a temporary ramp system here. I mean, I like the way they made sure there was no lip here. It looks like they had skid resistant material on the ramp. The grade, I was there as a tourist, so I didn't have my smart level or steel tape with me, but it looked like the width and the grade were okay. some things that did trouble me is I think it would have been good to have like a 4-foot landing here so that someone going up that ramp could rest at the top before they go back down. And the railing here, I don't believe complies with the requirements. I'd like to see maybe a guard or toe board or kick plate here, and the railing should be the appropriate height. I'm not sure it was the appropriate height, but at least they made an attempt to make it accessible. But the biggest concern I have about this, again, is the same sort of thing I've mentioned before, is think about a blind pedestrian using the cane or a low vision pedestrian. They may end up in this area or this area and get into trouble from a safety standpoint or injury standpoint. So as I keep saying in many of these, I think it would have been good to put some sort of detectable edging or channelizer here and also here, just to keep people out of material and the plumbing and the other stuff that's, you know, going on there. And that, again, that's not so much an accessibility issue as it is a safety and probably risk management, because if someone would get in there and get injured, then you have a lawsuit against the municipality, against the contractor. And so I think with just a little bit of effort and some channelizers here or detectable edging, they could have kind of eliminated those particular issues. This
Hey, Ron, it appears we
is
lost
also
audio.
Minneapolis. Same day probably as the previous photo, but it looked like it was, and so I removed the sidewalks into the, I think here you can see it looks like the strand board that's probably the base of the temporary ramp to get pedestrians into the street. And it appears that originally they had temporary traffic barriers the full length of the block. And I'm not sure what was going on, but my guess is at some point shortly before I took this photo, we removed these temporary barriers, maybe so flatbed trucks could get in here to deliver steel or concrete sections or something they needed in construction. And then, you know, the trucks left, and the trucks are probably going to be back the next morning. So rather than go to the effort and expense of putting the temporary traffic barriers back, they put in these channelizers, tubular markers, I guess you call them. But now, is that a detectable detour route, alternate route? I would say no, these are not a detectable edge. And so this is no longer a detectable route, at least on our right side here. But, you know, again, this is one of those challenges. I mean, I understand why they did this, and I probably would have done the same thing. But maybe what they really should have done here is just close this side of the street to pedestrians and detoured pedestrians over here, where you can hopefully have a detectable, accessible route. But that's an example of some of the issues that we face. And I did want to point out too that without external steel rails or internal steel framework, the water-filled longitudinal channelizers that I know are popular in many places don't have the capability to redirect vehicles, so they may not be substituted whenever a barrier is specified. Another consideration to think about with the use of the water-filled barriers is their deflection characteristics. Usually if struck, they will move significantly greater distance than the precast concrete barriers that have smaller deflection, and actually you can pin those into place. So again, you have to look at your situation in terms of the vehicular speeds, the vehicular volumes. Are there workers, you know, present that might need positive protection? Those sorts of things. But I think I have a few examples here to kind of distinguish or illustrate the differences. Some of you may recognize this. This is typical application 28 from the 11th edition of the MUTCD. I've rotated it 90 degrees so it fits on the slide better. But notice this looks like an urban situation. It looks like one lane in each direction and then a parking lane. So it's kind of a low speed street, like a downtown street. And we have some work going on here that's closing the sidewalk. And so notice what this typical application shows is it shows using pedestrian channelizers on both sides of the pedestrian path, and then temporary ramps to get pedestrians down to street level, and then a ramp to get them back up to the sidewalk. But I wanted to point out that what's being shown here is a pedestrian channelizer, not a traffic barrier, not a concrete barrier. And I like this version compared to the previous edition of the MUTCD because the previous edition didn't show the temporary ramps. It just showed detouring the pedestrians into the street, but didn't point out that there had to be a ramp to make that connection. So this drawing comes from the Minnesota DOT's temporary traffic control manual. And notice it's for low speed roadway, kind of like we had in that previous one from the MUTCD, like a downtown street. And notice they're showing the sidewalk is closed. And so we're detouring pedestrians to the street. So we need a ramp. And notice here, it looks like the alternate access route crosses, they call it a minor road, maybe think of it as an alley in town. So it crosses an alley, so it's a vehicular way. So we have to warn the visually impaired about it because there's no curb. The pedestrians are in the street now, so there's no curb. So we use detectable warnings on both sides of that alley to let the visually impaired pedestrians know they are crossing a vehicular way. And then they continue and go back up onto the sidewalk and then continue on their way. And the point is, notice again, on both sides of this pedestrian path, we use the pedestrian channelizers because it's a low speed situation. But now again, referring to the Minnesota DOT drawings, notice now this is for a high speed roadway or low speed multi-lane situation. And notice now, same sort of work area, although we don't have that alley shown here, but notice the pedestrians are detoured into the street. And notice on the building side, we have the pedestrian channelizer, but on the street side, we have the temporary traffic barriers, the concrete barriers, because now we have high speed or high volume traffic here. So we want positive protection between the pedestrian path and the vehicular path or the roadway. So it looks similar as before, but a different kind of roadway environment, high speed, high volume, and so we use the temporary traffic barriers. And of course, that's going to be kind of an engineering decision based on the specifics of the project and of the roadway, but those would be kind of the two alternatives that would be considered. That brings us to pathway width. We've talked about that when we talked about the PAR earlier today. Minimum continuous clear width under PROWAG 48 inches, free of obstructions. 60 is recommended, that way you don't have to worry about passing spaces. And of course, as I said earlier, where the clear width is less than 60, we do need to provide 5 foot by 5 foot passing spaces every 200 feet. R303.3 of PROWAG, the alternate pedestrian access route, says alternate PAR surfaces, so the surface now, shall comply with R302.6 or shall not be less accessible than the surface of the temporarily closed pedestrian circulation path. So the surfaces need to be accessible. That means smooth, stable, slip resistant, and it should be able to support a wheelchair under all conditions. Notice this lower left image here. Someone sent me this a few years ago and said, isn't this an acceptable alternate pedestrian path? And I replied, no, it's not, because it looks like it's just basically bare earth, and that is not going to be accessible under all conditions. Rain events may soften that soil. You know, this time of year right now, Morgantown, our ground is frozen solid, but in a few days or weeks, whenever we have our thaw, that the ground may be very soft because of the thawing earth. And so it's not going to be able to support a wheelchair under all conditions. And the path should be well drained and should be checked for standing water. I took this photo on the right about a year ago in Washington, D.C. I'm not sure they really kind of channelized or put a detectable edge properly at this location, but at least they do have a wide alternate access route here in what had been a parking lane. But notice a detail they didn't pay attention to was the standing water here at the base of the ramp, which can be a real nuisance, not only to people in wheelchairs who the wheels throw up the water all over their clothing, but it can also be an issue for able-bodied pedestrians trying to use that same path. Joints need to be closed and flush to prevent tripping issues and reduce the likelihood that canes or small wheels get trapped in gaps or spaces. We talked earlier about if you have grates in that pedestrian route, make sure they're perpendicular to the direction of travel, and any openings in grates need to comply with the PROWAG requirements. And pay attention to maintenance, so keep the paths clear of debris and adequately drained so you don't get mud and trash accumulating. So I ask if this is accessible. This is in Anchorage, Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska. An entire intersection was being rebuilt, and so they were detouring pedestrians actually across the unopened portion of the intersection. You can see across like 5 lanes of traffic. There is a gap here, but otherwise it looks like they used the channelizers appropriately. They're interconnected. You can see they provide a detectable edge so that the pedestrian can follow the detour. They can do hand trailing. But the issue I have is, notice the surface is just stone surface. So stone by itself is not generally an accessible surface, or there may be similar issues. These are 2 images from West Virginia communities where a gas company, different gas companies came in and did some work, gas line work, and this is how they left the projects. And in both cases, I suggested to the communities that they develop some sidewalk ordinances that relate to what condition the utilities should leave the sidewalks after their work is completed, because neither of these is an accessible sidewalk. They're not firm and stable. And so sometimes I get comments like, well, on the left there, if they had just rolled that when the gas company left, that would be accessible. And I sort of take exception to that. It might be accessible for a short time after that stone is rolled, but as weathering takes place, as traffic passes over that sidewalk, the stone is probably going to not remain firm and stable, and so it may not be an accessible surface for very long. And in one class where I was teaching this in person, someone said, well, I'm going to roll it every day. And I guess if you roll it every day, that may overcome some of the concerns I had about just rolling it initially and then forgetting about it. But every day in the pedestrian sense is literally every day, not just every work day. So if you're going to roll it every day, it needs to be every day, that may be an issue on a project. And there's additives and stabilizers and things that can be added to soil and stone to kind of stiffen it, make it maybe more like concrete, and something like that may work. The point here is, I think you can see there's a number of different options. So you have to look at your specific situation, where you are, the type of project, the duration of the project, those kinds of things. Or maybe like a cold patch type asphalt provides a surface that a wheelchair can negotiate, but you haven't invested a lot of money and you can remove it and then put down kind of permanent concrete or hot mix asphalt. Or maybe there's other things. I encourage people to think outside the box. This was a North Dakota DOT project. I thought this was kind of cool. It's conveyor belt, heavy duty rubber from a conveyor belt. It's only 3 feet wide, so it doesn't comply with PROWAG. But they told me they did a technical infeasibility write-up to document why they did it, and that they made this accessible to the extent practicable to do so. They did it on both sides of the street, and I thought that was just some outside the box thinking. I like that. It makes a nice, smooth, hard, firm, stable, slip resistant surface for some short period of time. Or I call these roll-up mats. I guess they're called beach mats or accessibility mats. That would what they were designed and are used for, is to allow wheelchairs to access beaches or lakefronts where you have sandy material that is not normally accessible to a wheelchair. These mats allow wheelchairs to, you can see, go over dunes or go over sand. So why not maybe put a mat like this over a stone surface, level it up a little bit, smooth it out, but then put this type of mat over it. You can make something firm and stable and be an accessible surface for a short period of time. And then with these, when you're done, you can roll these up and use these on other projects. So that may be a solution. Or here was something I just saw. This is in Alaska, where they have permafrost and mud and accessibility difficulties, but they use this open cell material to allow wheeled vehicles to, in this case, I think it was to access their trash or waste dump. But if you think about it, maybe if you fill these open cells with like sand or stone, so that the wheels of a wheelchair would not drop in there, you might be able to create an accessible surface using this material. And again, this would be on a construction job, this could be reusable and used over again. So think about different ways that you can provide an accessible surface. Temporary curb ramps. I showed some examples from different traffic control manuals. This is something we may need to do on certain projects, especially if we're detouring pedestrians into the street or a parking lane. They need to be the full width of the temporary route. 60 inches is recommended, but the minimum 48 inches is the requirement. The ramps need to lie in a single sloped plane. There should be a minimum of warping of that surface. And of course, normally with curb ramps, we don't worry about railings, but ADA says on curb ramps, that handrails on curb ramps are not required unless the ramp has a rise exceeding 6 inches and a length exceeding 72 inches. So something to keep in mind. Ramps, of course, should be firm, stable, slip resistant. They shouldn't warp or buckle under wheelchair use or other pedestrian use. And remember, it's not just manual wheelchairs, but they need to support the weight of motorized scooters and wheelchairs as well. And desirably, they should be color contrasting and have marked edges so that they are noticeable by pedestrians who have visual impairments. In terms of transition, meaning where the ramp joins the sidewalk or the street surface, that needs to be flush and free of abrupt changes. Remember, the maximum vertical lip 1/4 inch. If it's between 1/4 and 1/2 inch, you need to bevel it with a slope no greater than 50%. And maximum slopes of adjoining gutters and road surface immediately adjacent to the curb ramp, or the accessible route may not exceed 1 in 20 or 5%. And don't forget that should be a minimum 4 foot by 4 foot turning space at the top of the ramp. Desirably 5 feet if it's constrained. If there's a guard or a rail or something, then desirably that turning space should be 5 feet in the direction of travel. So here's some examples of what I call poor temporary ramps. Let's start on the right. This looks like it's homemade, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. My concern is that, notice they have a railing, which is fine, but that creates a constrained turning space or landing. And I'm not sure that's, looks like maybe that's 4 foot by 4 foot. To me, desirably, given this constraint of the railing, I'd want to make that landing 5 feet by 5 feet. So that's my main concern there. And how about here on the left? Notice that ramp, it just looks like a flimsy sheet of plywood. It's kind of warped there. And notice the way it's warped. There's really no transition. That plywood is, what, several inches probably above the curb there. Somebody did paint it. Looks like fluorescent orange, but that's not really going to help somebody in a wheelchair get onto that ramp. And this, the individual in the wheelchair here, this is Scott Windley. Scott works for the Access Board, and actually Scott played a big role in developing PROWAG. He probably knows PROWAG better than anybody else in the country. So this is just a demo. He's not going to go over that ramp. But one time Scott told me that just the batteries in his chair, the batteries alone weigh like 400 pounds, plus the chair, plus Scott's weight. So you can see this flimsy sheet of plywood is not going to probably accommodate that load. So these ramps, temporary ramps, need to be able to accommodate what some people call the power chairs, the motorized wheelchairs. But then also notice another detail here. There's not sufficient turning space at the base of this ramp. Even if that snow gets cleared out, there's not 4 or 5 feet there to allow Scott to turn to continue on his way. So you can see a lot of different potential issues with temporary ramps. The ramp itself, kind of the structure of it, the transitions, but also the turning spaces at the landings above and below the ramps. Not trying to promote or endorse any particular product, but there are commercially available modular temporary ramps. I took this a few years ago on High Street in Columbus at I think it was a building construction project. But notice, you can see this is a fold up kind of ramp, folds up. I think it weighs several hundred pounds, but it can be reused on other projects. 5 feet wide, has a 5 foot by 5 foot landing or turning space here, has a toe board or kick plate or guard at the base, has a railing that complies with PROWAG, and then it has the transitions here so you don't have a lip more than 1/4 inch. And so if you're doing a number of different projects where you may need temporary pedestrian ramps, this may be an approach to consider. How about these here in the lower right? Again, looks like a homemade ramp, which is fine. They've put in, it looks like a guard or kick plate. Looks like it's appropriate dimension. One thing I don't like is it looks like there's no transition here at the street. I don't know what that is. It almost looks like it could be an inch lip there. They've painted it, but that really doesn't remove the barrier that presents to someone, especially in a manual wheelchair, trying to go up that ramp. So that's my main issue here, is this lack of a transition. And how about this on the upper left? To me, this looks like one of these metal ramps that you find on beverage trucks, soft drink and beer trucks, where the driver can use that kind of temporary or portable ramp to get in and out of different locations where there might be stairs involved. And here you can see it looks like it's been adapted to create a temporary curb ramp. I don't know if it's wide enough, maybe it is. I like the way it has guards on the side. They've painted the edges yellow. Looks like they have a slip resistant surface. They have a relatively good transition here. My concern with these types of ramps is really two. One is that you can make those almost any slope you want, so they might be steeper than 8.3%. But in this case, a bigger concern is notice what does someone do, or where does someone go after they go down the ramp? There's no channelization to direct the pedestrians where to go. So that's my big concern, I guess, with this, is it really, once pedestrians are in the street, there's not much guidance provided that I can see in terms of how to proceed or where to go, or there needs to be some separation between the pedestrians and the vehicular traffic. This is called a built-out ramp. Notice it extends from the sidewalk out into the street. Generally, these are not preferred, and in fact, in on-street parking, access aisles for on-street parking, PROWAG specifically prohibits built-out ramps. They can be a tripping hazard for pedestrians. There's also a drainage issue. I'll notice here they did put in a pipe underneath the ramp. And so generally these are frowned upon, but the reason I show this is I like to say when it comes to ADA, at least my personal opinion is we should never say never. I don't like these built out ramps personally, but I think here, this may be a really good solution to a temporary problem. There's Scott again, Scott Windley in his chair, and there's temporary traffic barriers, the concrete barriers here. So he's not just going into the street, he's in the alternate pedestrian access route. But I think for a few months that this will be here, that is probably not a bad solution to the challenge of getting pedestrians into the street at this location. Personally, I might want to make it a little wider and maybe put like a yellow or white edge line on each side just to alert pedestrians that there's an edge there. But even something like this may work in certain situations, even though it's generally discouraged. How about this? Notice here the sidewalk's closed for some reason. There's a wide grass strip. Of course, grass is not an accessible surface, so they build a boardwalk out to the street, and they're going to detour pedestrians into the parking lane. They have a railing, which I like. Personally, if this was mine, I think I'd want to put a detectable edge at the bottom of that railing there to help the visually impaired. And then they have the temporary traffic barriers in the roadway to separate pedestrians from vehicular traffic. But if you recall earlier, I said one of the requirements of these channelizers or barriers is that they be interconnected, and it looks from the gaps here to me like these are not interconnected. So these need to be interconnected, so no gaps to present a continuous detectable edge to pedestrians. And then we have the ramp down to street level. I'm not sure why they didn't just square that off. I don't understand that. And that lip looks like more than a 1/4 inch vertical. Again, looks like they've spray painted it with fluorescent orange paint to attract pedestrians' attention. But again, that's not going to help somebody with an assistive device get over that lip. So a better transition there would have been appropriate. Working overhead, sometimes that happens, right? Work takes place overhead, especially like in downtown or business districts where you have multi-story buildings. So short-term closure of walkways and providing alternate routes needs to be provided anytime there's construction materials or operations over a walkway. Or in this case, you can see there's operation over the walkway, or there will be, But in this case, the issue for me as a pedestrian was I was walking in the direction I took this photo, and the lift here was moving towards me. And notice there's no spotter or person there, you know, either alerting the driver or alerting pedestrians that there might be a potential conflict. There was no advanced warning signs on the sidewalk alerting pedestrians, so that was a concern. Or what do you think of this? Notice here there's work, this was window washing work taking place over the sidewalk. So of course we don't want pedestrians underneath when that's taking place. This was the contractor's traffic control, again, just yellow caution tape, which as we've talked about is not appropriate. There should have been a detectable closure the full width of that sidewalk, and then some sort of detour route, probably to the other side of the street, identified for pedestrians. Sometimes where work takes place above a walkway for an extended period of time, like maybe a long-term project, maybe building a high-rise or something like that, we may need a canopied walkway to protect pedestrians from falling objects or falling debris. And this is noted in section 6C of the MUTCD. And they say, the MUTCD says, if an accessible route uses canopied walkways, the walkway should have a minimum 7 feet of headroom. And remember, PROWAG calls for 80, so there is a little bit of a discrepancy or difference between the two. And MUTCD says objects with leading edges more than 27 inches and not more than 80 inches above the walkway are not permitted to protrude more than 4 inches into the pedestrian pathway. So this is the protruding object criteria we talked about earlier with respect to PROWAG. And here are some examples of overhead protection. Notice here on the left, you can see work taking place overhead, and they have a canopy structure to protect pedestrians from falling objects. I kind of like this upper right here. This looks like one of those intermodal shipping containers like you see on trucks or on ships or on rail cars. And it looks like they've cut some windows into it, put some lighting. They have a tow board here, a detectable rail at the bottom, a handrail here. Probably have to do something in terms of ramps at either ends because of the frame of those trailers or containers, I should say. But I kind of like that example of overhead protection. And then here in the lower right, this is in Maryland. It's the C&O Canal Trail, a historic trail along the Potomac River. This is in Maryland. The contractors working on the bridge. They're replacing like thousands of bolts, as I understood it. And so the Maryland DOT required the contractor to have a canopy to protect trail users from falling objects or tools or whatever. And so the contractor put in a, looks like a plywood canopy. My only concern with this is not so much the canopy itself, which looks fine, but notice the entrance to the canopy from the trail. This area here, this is not, there's a type 3 barricade again, it's not detectable. There's that maybe snow fencing. I think Lisa raised that question. In my mind, this arrangement is not detectable. There's no toe board or kick plate or base there, detection edge. If this was my project, I think I would call for some sort of detectable edge or channelizer here to kind of channelize trail users into the canopy area. Again, you can see there's signing both here and here, but that really doesn't help the visually impaired. Just a few words about handrails and guide rails. Handrails assist ambulatorily disabled pedestrians to navigate steep grades They're used to maintain balance, transfer weight, and prevent falls. Guide rails are not intended to provide support, but they just provide visual and tactile guidance to pedestrians along a route. ADAG does have mentioned some handrail requirements, and you can see them here. Guide rails need to be distinguished from handrails so that the user is aware that the guide rail is not a weight-bearing device. And this is usually accomplished by making the guide rail kind of semi-flexible or else have a non-graspable shape so that it's clear that this is not like a handrail or something that you can use for support. It's strictly for guidance. Sidewalk closures. Mentioned them a few times already. But notice what the MUTCD says. Where pedestrians with visual disabilities normally use a closed sidewalk, a barrier that is detectable by a person with a visual disability traveling with the aid of a long cane shall be placed across the full width of the closed pedestrian facility. So having a detectable barrier across the full width of the sidewalk is a requirement under the MUTCD. How about this? That sign is in the MUTCD, but using that sign alone represents a subpart E violation, in my opinion. It doesn't communicate with all pedestrians. It only communicates with sighted pedestrians. So what could be done is we can use that sign for the sighted pedestrians, but then we need a barricade or barrier, detectable barrier across the full width of this sidewalk. How about this? Looks a little better, right? They have a barrier, detectable barrier across the full width of the sidewalk. They included a sign for the sighted pedestrians. So that aspect is good, but notice pedestrians, I guess, are intended to go in the street. At least that's my impression. But notice that there's no curb ramp to get them from the sidewalk to the street, nor is there any, there should be channelizers here to separate pedestrians from the vehicular traffic. So I'll give them partial credit for the way they closed the sidewalk, but not any credit for the way they handled pedestrians in terms of an alternate path. Or how about this? Building construction project, sidewalk closed, not really it needs to be a detectable barricade. The cone can be detected, the cones can be detected, this fence post can be detected, some of these other things can be detected, but the issue is, I'm not sure any of those convey the message that the sidewalk is closed. It may take a while for a visually impaired pedestrian to figure out exactly what's going on there. And then notice they thought about have channelizers. Here are the temporary traffic barriers, I should say, and it looks like a more than 5 foot wide alternate access route. But to me, the issue is how do we get pedestrians into that alternate access route? There's no real guidance or channelization to get them into that route, and this is a challenge. It looks like this is a driveway, so you probably can't put devices across here. Also, for pedestrians trying to get in there, looks like there's probably a curb return here. This is probably the level or the flush portion, but pedestrians, saying with a mobility device trying to get there, they may have some cross slope and grade issues with that driveway trying to get into that alternate path. So offhand, I don't have a good solution, but I think this photo does a good job of trying to illustrate some of the challenges and some of the issues we face in trying to incorporate these accessibility principles into our temporary traffic control for sidewalks. Or how about this? Notice here, the sidewalk is closed, there is a detectable barricade across the full width of the sidewalk. That's a good thing. Notice there is a sidewalk closed ahead sign in front of that. That may make it difficult for a visually impaired pedestrian to detect the actual barricade. And then notice also there's another barricade with a sidewalk closed sign kind of right in the curb ramp, which would interfere with the use of the ramp, also interfere with a wheelchair turning on this landing area here. So this is, I would say, partially okay. The other parts of it, not so okay, especially this barricade in the middle of the curb ramp. I think if this was my project, I probably would not use this sidewalk closed ahead sign. I think I'd move the white channelizing barricade to down here to close off the sidewalk. Then remove this barricade, it could be used elsewhere, but probably take the sidewalk closed plaque off of that and put it on the relocated barrier. So that way the sign, the panel is attached to the barricade, so we don't need a separate support for that. So that way we close the sidewalk. We also provide notice that the sidewalk is closed, but I'm not sure then this barricade or this sign would really be needed. Another thing to consider is communication devices, audible devices. The MUTCD, in fact, notes that the most desirable way to provide guidance through temporary traffic control for people with visual disabilities is a speech message provided by an audible information device. And here again, there's a discrepancy between the MUTCD and PROWAG. The MUTCD uses should. PROWAG says these audible devices shall be used. But one thing to think about, to me, if you can use detectable channelizing devices to define an alternate route, that may minimize or even eliminate the need for audible devices. But not every project can do that. Some projects, the alternate route is going to be maybe not clear by detectable devices, and so you probably need to provide communication devices. But one way to reduce the need for the audible devices is by having a good detectable path, alternate route. And here's an example. There's a variety of these products that are available. Basically, they're activated by motion sensor, and then they play a pre-recorded message. Or some of them, I guess, work continuously, but most of them are activated by motion, and then they play a recorded message. As a personal opinion is, I think there's a need for some guidance in this area in terms of the kind of the messages that should be used. But here's kind of an example. Attention pedestrians, sidewalk closed 1 block ahead, cross here to use other side of the street. But obviously each project's going to require its own messages because the path will be different in each case. Something else to consider is the use of guides. And this would be maybe be in areas where you have higher concentrations of pedestrians and individuals with disabilities. But a human guide can provide information orally or verbally to assist pedestrians in navigating the pathway. So we don't do that, of course, in the roadway environment. We don't want our flaggers communicating with drivers, but on the sidewalk, human guides can provide audible communication. Communication with the public in terms of projects, especially larger projects where you may have detours and things involved, providing this information on project websites and through other mechanisms is helpful. Now, some best practices and other considerations. Determine the level of accessibility needed for pedestrians in the temporary traffic control zone by observing existing pedestrian travel, and then make accommodations prior to the start of work. Especially on long-term projects, get information or get input from local pedestrians, including people with disabilities. Or I like to say, at the very least, put yourself in the pedestrian's shoes. Get a cane and a wheelchair and go through the route. Is it confusing? Is the detour easily or clearly communicated? Is it accessible to someone in a wheelchair? Does it require crossing heavy traffic? This can go a long way. Also document this, and this is a great way of showing you're trying to make a good faith effort to address the accessibility issues. As we've talked about, prioritize routing pedestrians through the work area if it's safe to do so. You may have to narrow the route or move it to the street. If you can't maintain safe and accessible routes through the construction or around it, then, as I think I mentioned in part one, we may need to think about other options like a shuttle van service or something like that. Think about phasing of construction. In this case, the project actually is, the big project is going to be on the other side of the street in the background. There's some utility work taking place here. The sidewalk will be removed. And so the plan is detour pedestrians to the sidewalk you see in the foreground. However, it was not compliant. It was not accessible. So phase one of this project was to bring this sidewalk into compliance with PROWAG so it could be used as the detour route. Work on only one side of the street at a time. This is a West Virginia community. I'm not sure what happened here, but it looks like there was a building construction project that closed the sidewalk on this side of the street. And then the street department decided to do a sidewalk project on the other side of the street, closing the sidewalk. So right now, this, what you see here, this block is inaccessible to pedestrians. I suspect the merchants are not happy and just not a good situation. So if you can, try to schedule things so that work is taking place on only one side of the street at a time. Pay attention to vehicles, equipment, or materials that can block sidewalks or curb ramps or other infrastructure. Maybe have a policy that approval is needed before these things, these blockages can occur, or at least some monitoring of it. Or how about this? It looks like here the contractor is just using this block, the sidewalk on this block, as part of the construction site storage, and the sidewalk is now inaccessible. And sadly, there's no sidewalk on the opposite side of the street. So this street is basically inaccessible to pedestrians. Check that channelizing devices and barricades don't impede sight distance or block access to push buttons or signals or ADA infrastructure. Crosswalks provide access to curb ramps, which are considered the basic element of accessibility, so they need to be kept clear or barricaded and a detour route identified. And so that may take some education, awareness, enforcement on the part of the contractor or construction personnel. Practice constant enforcement of these policies. And as I've said, I think a few times, document, document, document. Revise agency policies to include accessible and detectable alternate pedestrian pathways. And we had a question earlier about, I guess, how to encourage contractors to do these things. I would suggest make these temporary pedestrian accommodations a separate pay item in the contracts. That helps legitimize it for the contractors so they know they'll actually get paid for it and it's not just extra work that isn't necessary. Any questions on that before we get into some examples? We may not have time to go over all of them, but I did want to maybe cover a few kind of example setups.
Thanks, Ron. I tell you what, let's go ahead into the examples and then we'll try to cover a few questions quickly at the end.
That's a good idea. I like that. Thank you, Mike.
Okay.
So I think we'll maybe just do one here and then the first part of two. This first example or set of examples, someone from the Ohio division of FHWA shared with Victoria Beal, and she suggested I include them in the presentation here. So these are just things that Federal Highway Administration personnel found in some of their spot checks. And it looks, and I wasn't involved in these projects, but it looks like here they were maybe doing some pedestrian improvements, including providing a pedestrian path through the island here, this channelizing island. But notice, looks like the construction looks to be complete, but they have a portable yield sign with the feet of which are placed right in that pedestrian path, pedestrian refuge area, and so it is not usable. I realize this is not permanent, but at least for the short time this is there, pedestrians, at least those with mobility impairments, are not able to cross there. Here's another example. Notice the corner is excavated and the sidewalk here that apparently going to put in curb ramps. But as I started earlier this morning, is this an accessible and detectable work setup? And of course, the answer is no. They're just using the yellow caution tape. Also, what should be done here is there should be a detectable barricade placed here just to prevent pedestrians from even getting into the street, since they can't do anything once they get to that corner. I guess the good thing is looks like they're only working on one corner at a time. I've been in some communities where they'll excavate all four corners to put in new curb ramps, and then there's no pedestrian access. So it is better, again, we talk about phasing and staging. At least it appears they're doing that here. So those are a couple examples from Ohio. Maybe we'll have time to go through one quick case study example. This is a tort claim example. I call it the accessible crosswalk. This is a Midwestern city. It's not in Ohio, but this street you can see is being closed off because they're doing some streetscape work off to the far left, but also the contractor's trailer and some material storage is also off to the far left. So sometimes these barricades are moved to allow vehicle access into the area there on the left. But what happened, one rainy night, two women were walking away, or walking in the same direction here. The camera is looking into the background. And as part of the project, apparently they cut off the power to the street lights in the area, so it was dark, and she tripped on one of the angle iron feet of the type 3 barricade and sustained a permanent arm injury. And so she filed a tort claim against the municipality, against the general contractor, and the traffic control device subcontractor, alleging negligent placement of the type 3 barricades, which created a hazard for pedestrians. So it's not clear which of these feet she tripped on. In fact, not even clear that this is exactly how it looked on the night in question, but this is kind of the setup. You can see many of these feet, maybe all of them, are in a marked crosswalk. The defendants argued that there was more than 3 feet of width available in the crosswalk, and so they said the walkway complied with ADA criteria. And they further argued that if the walkway is accessible, if it complies with ADA, then it's safe. And I think I addressed my thoughts on this earlier. And actually, a confidential out-of-court settlement was reached just before trial. So a jury never had a chance to react to this. But in my mind, one thing that could have been done maybe would be use this kind of a setup. This is not the same location, but notice they attached the type 3 barricade to some pedestrian channelizers, so there's no feet projecting into the pedestrian path. So lessons learned: just because a facility is accessible doesn't mean it's safe. Details are important, and probably the plans should have shown where those type 3 barricades needed to be located. And there should have been communication between the parties, and probably additional training for the designers and the builders. And so I think we're just about out of time. I'll stop here. Mike, I'll leave it up to you in terms of questions. I'm available. I can stay on a little while longer if you want to take some questions.
All right, thanks, Ron. We've had a few questions along the way. I think the good news is, in most cases, as you were proceeding through the slides, you've really answered a lot of those questions. Just a general one, and this is more for our LTAP team. Mauricio was asking, can you please share the presentation and the recording? So in the handout section of the GoToWebinar panel is a copy of the slides from this afternoon, but I want to mention that within the next few days, our Ohio LTAP team will be sending out a follow-up email that will include links to both the morning and afternoon presentations today, and also links to the video recordings of these webinars, and we post those to our Ohio LTAP YouTube channel. So those are really great resources that you will have access to within a few days with that follow-up email. Ron, I guess this is more of a philosophical question from Greg. He says, quote, why do we see so many cities non-compliant with the law after 36 years?
Yeah, I share that same thought, and almost every time I go to a community to do training or to do technical assistance or something. Yeah, this is one of the, I mean, in terms of PROWAG generally, we still have a long way to go overall, but I think what you're saying, and I agree with you, it seems in kind of in temporary traffic control, we're maybe farther behind than we are in some of the other areas. But one thing that I am noticing, and I'm not saying this is good or bad, but I guess it's reality, is in communities, when I do training, in person, I get comments like, well, we have this blind citizen or this visually impaired resident who actually videotapes our work zones and is threatening us with a lawsuit if we don't do it right. So I mean, I think, to me, that my sense is that sort of thing is happening more and more, and so that I think should drive agencies to pay attention to this and to try to do it right and document what we're doing and those sorts of things. So I'm hopeful that kind of progress will sort of start to accelerate in this area. And again, I'm not saying that's how it should be, but as I think many of us in public works know, oftentimes the threat of lawsuits and tort claims, or in this case, civil rights claims, can and does drive things in terms of moving forward.
Well, thanks, Ron, for your comments. And as far as the questions we did not have time to get to, we always appreciate the fact that Ron provides his email address, and you are okay with people emailing questions to you?
Oh, definitely, yeah. Feel free to. The one thing I would say, and I don't say this to discourage folks, but if you do have a specific, kind of a site-specific question, it's always helpful to me if you could include maybe some photographs or a Google aerial or a section of plans or something, just to help me better understand the context of the situation. But yeah, I'm always glad to try to offer another set of eyeballs or give some thoughts on those kind of situations.
Well, we absolutely appreciate that, Ron. And right now, people are typing into the questions box. Thank you so much for today's presentations and for sharing this information that is very, very helpful. So we appreciate that. And thanks to everyone in our audience for participating today. And we hope to see you again at future webinars. Have a great day.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the great questions.